Okay, this is a paper I wrote about Plato's Ion dialogue, and I'm going to read it at this point in the sequence of lectures because it reinforces the patterns that I've claimed that I see in Plato's dialogues. If I have time at the end, I might review that. So the idea is that the dialogue is tragic insofar as Ion lives in the cave. Ion also, it has the patterns in Plato's dialogues of the cave, the light, the cave, the divided line, the two roads, and also it deals with the topic of misreading Homer and the corrupting influence that had on the Athenians. So, first of all, following on the last lecture, the Athenians are misreading Homer. Partly, in this case, the Rhapsodes, the people who publicly recite Homer, are also corrupt, so they're all in it together. But the Athenians are on board with Ion's vanity and irrationality. And then partly that this is before the fall of Athens, that the underlying plot is that this is one more way the Athenians corrupted their institutions and came to a bad end. They had a mistake in judgment about what the point of all those institutions was. And they understood freedom to mean freedom to do whatever you want. In this case, Ion's freedom to seek status, money, and power, and his freedom to read Homer however he wanted to interpret it or use the texts for whatever goals he decided, and then the people would judge him. It turns out all he did was basically punch their emotional buttons, just like the sophists, and if he managed to make them respond emotionally in some way that persuaded them that he was good, then he got money. And if he didn't, he didn't. So there is no third party here. So there is no young person that Socrates is trying to educate, as there is in the image of the cave. But always in the dialogues, the reader is supposed to be there, like the student, and also the reader could be one of the Athenian citizens, the average Joe Athenian, because these are the groups that needed to learn the lessons they didn't learn, and the city came to a bad end, along with everybody in it. Okay, the uses of Homer in Plato's Ion. In the Ion dialogue, Socrates is discussing the epic poems of Homer with Ion, who has just returned from a contest at the festival of Asclepius in Epidaurus. Ion has won first prize, making him the most popular Homeric rhapsode in all of Greece. It's fitting, then, that Socrates should discuss with him the meaning of Homer's works, how they should be presented, what sort of audience response indicates a successful performance, and on what grounds a Homeric rhapsode should be given first prize. From the outset, Plato portrays Ion and Socrates as opposites. This is the two roads. Ion dresses up to go to festivals and recite from Homer before large crowds. Socrates almost never dresses up and talks to people one-on-one in front of whoever happens to be around. As far as the reader can tell, there is no audience present. Socrates simply initiates the discussion. Ion is a paid professional. Socrates is an unpaid amateur. Ion memorizes and rehearses before each performance. Socrates responds to whatever his interlocutors say. Ion's goal is to elicit an emotional response from his audiences. Socrates' goal, here and elsewhere in Plato's dialogues, is to encourage his interlocutors to know themselves and to lead more thoughtful, examined lives. Given the differences between them, it should come as no surprise that Ion and Socrates have difficulty communicating. What is surprising is how clearly this short dialogue presents such distinct positions on fundamental questions about the nature of art. Each character, implicitly or explicitly, takes at least a rudimentary position on the following questions. Which human creations should be classified as art? What kinds of characters should be represented in works of art? How should the written word be recited before an audience? What sort of audience response is appropriate? An emotional or a strictly aesthetic response? How should professional art critics evaluate the works of art and artistic exhibitions and performances? The dialogue is divided into 3 sections. Again, 3 sections. Each addresses a question which, in turn, implies a response to the questions listed above. The first section addresses the question, which is more important in the characterization, presentation, response to, and criticism of art? Is it content or form? Is it substance or style? The second section addresses the question, what is or ought to be the relation between emotion and inspiration on the one hand, and reason or knowledge on the other, in the characterization, presentation, response to, and criticism of art? The third section addresses the question, can art be classified as knowledge or skill? Does it belong to the same class as the professional activity people engage in to earn a living and to provide for their basic physical needs? A question concerning motivation also arises in each section. First, can art be motivated by the desire for social reputation and status? Second, can art be motivated by greed? And third, can art be motivated by the desire for power? Plato makes, and wants his readers to make, a distinction between philosophical and unphilosophical ways of understanding all aspects of human aesthetic experience. As the dialogue proceeds, Ion's position becomes clear, and the problems with his view are drawn out both explicitly and implicitly. Socrates demonstrates an alternative use of art in his artfully presented speeches throughout the dialogue and in the positions they represent. Through the use of question and answer in the first section, practical speech in the second, and short recitations from Homer in the third, Socrates models a kind of philosophical aesthetic. Through either reading or hearing the Ion dialogue being read, Plato's audience can have a philosophical aesthetic experience. By contrast, the experience Ion describes in himself and in his audiences when he performs is neither philosophical nor truly aesthetic. Socrates also is acting as the dialectician here. As I said ever since I discussed Phaedrus, he has figured out what kind of soul Ion has, and he uses the kind of speech that will speak to Ion's soul and try to turn him around from the cave to the light, from ignorance to wisdom. The dialogue setting provides an appropriate context for discussing literary aesthetics. Ion has just won first prize at the festival of Asclepius in Epidaurus. Every society structures times, such as festivals, for rest and celebration. What citizens do during their leisure time is philosophically significant. Do people seek educational activities, enabling them to return to their lives with greater insight and courage? Or do they seek activities which nurture irrational emotions, further blinding their intellects and emotions? As his popularity indicates, Many Greeks spend leisure time listening to Ion. By finding out what Ion thinks he's doing, the reader can get some idea of the spirit of the times in Greece. But the conversation between Socrates and Ion also demonstrates how literature has political uses. The same books used to inspire one generation of Greeks to fend off the Persians and reaffirm the values of Greek democracy are used in the next generation to justify empire building and conquest. Ion himself uses the text to further his own pride, ambition, and greed. Even those who teach Homer today pursue some sort of personal, social, and political agenda which frames the discussion and affects greatly what students learn. No detached observer or disinterested teacher can discuss literary texts without accounting for the context within which he or she shapes the conversation. In Ion, there are simply those like Ion, whose motives are irrational, and those like Socrates, whose motive is to use literary discussion to lead himself and Ion to living more examined lives. That this festival honors Asclepius, god of medicine, is significant. A festival appropriately honoring the god of medicine should invigorate healthy souls or heal unhealthy ones. Ion should play a physician's role, imparting psychological health. He recites from venerable books depicting the culture's heroes, models to be admired and imitated. Eliciting deep emotional responses from audiences, Ion's performances tap into the collective psyche and the collective unconscious. An interview with Ion, then, may reveal the state of psychological health of the Greeks of his time. Unfortunately, the god of medicine, Asclepius, once abused his skill by restoring Hippolytus to life at Artemis' request. Zeus killed him with a thunderbolt, so he abused his power. He wasn't supposed to defy nature to the point of bringing someone back to life. By analogy, Ion, too, has great skill in resurrecting the heroes in Homer's texts. Whether he does so in a way Zeus would approve is left for the reader to decide. The image of Ion as a physician of the Greek soul significantly brings to mind an image of Socrates as physician of the soul, as described in the Sophist. Although the Sophist is dated much later than the Ion, Socrates' role in the Sophist recurs throughout Plato's texts. Also, it's just the notion of tragedy is a catharsis. The whole point of literature and art is to heal a sick soul, to inspire a soul to flourish better. It has a physical health. There's an analogy between physical health and mental health. Socrates sets up an analogy between a physician who removes physical obstacles from the body to create physical health, and an educator who removes ignorant opinions from an interlocutor's mind to create a healthier soul. Quote, "For as the physician considers that the body will receive no benefit from taking food until the internal obstacles have been removed, so the purifier of the soul is conscious that his patient will receive no benefit from the application of knowledge until he is refuted, and from refutation learns modesty. He must be purged first and made to think that he knows only what he knows and no more." Unquote. In the Ion dialogue, Socrates encourages Ion to examine a number of opinions about art and aesthetic experience. Ion is proven ignorant, but refuses to acknowledge his ignorance. Ion's opinions about art are not outrageous. On the contrary, they are widely accepted. Through Socratic elenkos, Socrates indirectly shows not that Ion's opinions are completely wrong, but that they are inadequate, insufficient. It's up to Plato's readers to learn from Socrates the lessons Ion fails to learn. Examining the text more closely reveals what the reader is intended to learn. The first section clarifies Ion's and Socrates' positions on a fundamental question about art. What is more important, content or style? Socrates favors content over style, while Ion's position is the reverse. This is not to say that Socrates considers style irrelevant. Certainly Plato's dialogues display a keen facility for and interest in literary style. The mistaken opinion Ion holds, however, is that style is all that counts. Ion is keenly aware of Homer's superb style, but seems uninterested in discussing the content of Homer's work. The implicit message is not that style can be ignored, but rather that content cannot be ignored. Ion's first mistake is his willingness to ignore Homer's message. Socrates makes his point in this way. Quote, I envy you rhapsodes. You must be conversant with many excellent poets, and especially with Homer, the best and most divine of all. You have to understand his thought, and not merely learn his lines. In fact, one could never be a rhapsode if one did not comprehend the utterances of the poet, for the rhapsodist must become an interpreter of the poet's thought to those who listen. Unquote. This is more evidence that Plato didn't think Homer was as bad as he describes in the Republic. Okay. This is Socrates' view of art. Content is more important than form, substance than style. Carefully interpreting a writer's thought is necessary, albeit not sufficient, for being a good rhapsode. Ion claims that literary interpretation is unnecessary for giving a good performance of Homer's work. Ion wants to prove this by performing for Socrates. Quote, Socrates, it really is worthwhile to hear how well I have embellished Homer. Unquote. Ion not only enjoys embellishing Homer, he enjoys being embellished by the judges. Quote, in my opinion, I deserve to be crowned with a wreath of gold by the Homeridae. Unquote. Ion uses his skill at performing to gain social recognition, to gratify his ambition. Although Ion is clearly preoccupied with his performance style, Socrates tries to elicit what he thinks Homer's work says about the human condition. Socrates asks, quote, wasn't his subject mainly war, and hasn't he discussed the mutual relationships of men, good and bad, and the relations of the gods to one another and to men? Unquote. The question is deliberately ambiguous. Socrates is either merely summarizing events in Homer or suggesting that, embedded within the narratives, Homer expresses ideas and provides lessons about good and evil, justice and injustice, and how to live well. Socrates distinguishes between literary criticism that privileges Homer's ability to communicate, his writing style, from criticism that analyzes and assesses the ethical and political ideas presented in the text. Certainly Socrates is portrayed here and elsewhere in Plato's dialogues as more concerned with the latter. If Ion recites and interprets Homer with a view to Homer's reflections upon ethics and justice, then Ion should also be able to recite from Hesiod and the other poets, because they all treat the same themes. Ion's reputation, however, is based on reading Homer only. Socrates asks Ion about this. Quote, how is it then that you are skilled in Homer, but not in Hesiod or the other poets? Haven't they dealt with these same themes? Ion responds, yes, Socrates, but not in the same way. This indicates that Ion is preoccupied with Homer's literary genre because it is unique to Homer. Socrates then says, when several persons are discussing a given subject, the man who can distinguish the one who's talking well on it and the one who's talking badly will always be the same. Again, Socrates takes talking well to mean the ability to talk about content, about the subjects of literature. Socrates' comment implies that art critics should first examine the quality of an artist's ideas and only then the artist's ability to communicate effectively through literary style. Since Ion is incapable of discussing Homer's themes, the critics who gave Ion first prize must have valued Ion's ability to embellish Homer. Socrates, it seems, is critical of such art critics. Socrates' questions finally drive Ion into perplexity. Quote, then what can be the reason, Socrates, for my behavior? When anyone discusses any other poet, I pay no attention, and can offer no remark of any value. I frankly doze. But whenever anyone mentions Homer, immediately I'm awake, attentive, and full of things to say. Unquote. At this point, Ion could reconsider whether he is as good a rhapsode as he, the judges, and the audience think. Socrates has tried to humble Ion, to remove from him this particular mistake in judgment about art, namely, that style is more important than substance. But Ion refuses to be humbled. Quote, of this thing I am conscious, that I excel all men in speaking about Homer, and on him have much to say, and that everybody else agrees I do it well, but on the other poets I do not. Well then, Socrates, see what that means. Unquote. Ion will not be purged of the conceit he has about his skill at speaking about Homer. Socrates' first attempt at philosophical catharsis fails. Ion does not know himself. He cannot give an account of who he is and what he does. He asks Socrates to do it for him. Throughout this section, Socrates engages Ion in a dialogue, avoiding the monologue form Ion is so skilled at delivering. Socrates' aim is to pursue truth rather than to gratify ambition and personal fame. Socrates refers to his own use of speech, both his way of speaking and the goal of his speech. Quote, I have nothing else to tell besides the truth, after the fashion of the ordinary man. Unquote. In spite of Ion's capacity to embellish, he is driven into a state of perplexity because he can neither explain nor defend what he does. In spite of its simplicity, Socrates' speech gets to the most serious questions about the nature and purpose of art and reveals Ion's ignorance and that of the Athenians who honor him. Instead of criticizing Ion outright, Socrates says, quote, not from art and knowledge comes your power to speak concerning Homer. It is a power divine. For a poet is a light and winged thing, and holy, and never able to compose until he has become inspired, and reason is no longer in him. Unquote. So that reminds me of Phaedrus and the myth in the Phaedrus, where Socrates brings up, divine inspiration. Okay. Here, the overriding issue is the relation between emotion or inspiration and reason in the arts. Many features of the passage imply that Socrates presents Ion with another view of art, which is too extreme. Certainly, the interpretation of both the poet and the rhapsode can be distinguished from reason, and perhaps at the moment of inspiration, reason is no longer in either of them, the rhapsode or the poet or the audience. But This does not mean there is no need, eventually, to examine inspiration with reason. Socrates' questions about Homer indicate that he believes Homer has thought a great deal about issues of virtue and justice. Socrates also indicates that even an emotionally effective rhapsode like Ion should have thought about Homer's ideas before developing his skill at performing Homer's works. Artists or rhapsodes who reflect upon their work, however, must go beyond the original divine inspiration through the use of philosophical reflection in order to organize their ideas into a coherent work of art or a meaningful interpretation of a work of art. Why does Socrates inflate this view about divine inspiration of the poet and the performer? Socrates wants to demonstrate to Ion and Plato to his readers why this view is compelling yet also incomplete. The interaction between the characters indicates Socrates' motive when Ion first responds to this speech. Quote, Socrates, your words in some way touch my very soul, and it does seem to me that by dispensation from above, good poets convey to us these utterances of the gods. Unquote. Socrates is performing for Ion in the same way Ion performs for his audiences. Okay, so just like Phaedrus, actually, he's giving him this imaginative, speech. Socrates changes his rhetorical style from question and answer in the first third of the dialogue to lengthier speech performed with embellished emotional language. The speech itself reflects the position it presents. The intention of the speech is to draw out emotion rather than to tell the whole truth. The speech successfully elicits an emotional response from Ion because it tells only part of the truth and uses visual, metaphorical images that stimulate Ion's imagination rather than his discursive reason. At the same time, the content of the speech denigrates reason in favor of emotion and imagination in creating and reciting poetry. Again, that's a perfect example of Socrates acting as the dialectician that recognizes the soul of a certain type and uses the language that's going to awaken that soul in order eventually to turn it around. Okay. Thus far, then, Socrates has used two different speech styles, each advancing a view of art related to that type of speech. In the first third of the dialogue, Socrates engages Ion in discursive speech, the style implying that content and meaning should be the most important feature of art. Socrates even refers to the function of his speech style at the end of section 1. Quote, I have nothing else to tell besides the truth, after the fashion of the ordinary person. Unquote. This speech drives Ion into a state of perplexity because he cannot defend what he does. Socrates next uses embellished emotional speech, which claims that poets are out of their minds and work from inspiration only. This speech falsely inspires Ion. Socrates' speech flatters him, and Ion responds emotionally to it. This is a model of how Ion has acquired his reputation. He recites speeches stimulating the imagination and provoking emotional release, even flattering his audiences into believing they're educated because they have used leisure time to enjoy responding emotionally to Homer's works. Unlike Ion's recitations, however, this is not the end of the conversation. Socrates continues the dialogue to discuss the emotional responses Ion elicits from himself and his audiences. Ion describes his own emotions while reciting. Quote, whenever I recite a tale of pity, my eyes are filled with tears, and when it is one of horror or dismay, my hair stands up on end with fear. unquote. Ion's description of the emotional effect he has on his audiences shows exactly why the claim that a poet is divinely inspired and out of his mind is inadequate and dangerous. Quote, I have to give them very close attention, for if I set them weeping, I myself shall laugh when I get my money. But if they laugh, it is I who have to weep at losing it. These are people who pay after the performance. Okay. Ion's remark shows exactly why the claim that a poet is divinely inspired and irrational is inadequate. Quote, I have to give them very close attention, for if I set them weeping, I myself shall laugh when I get my money. Okay. Ion is not a light and winged thing whose inspiration comes from the gods. Rather, he has learned how to manipulate human emotions, both his and his audiences, to gain wealth. Certainly Ion is faithful to Homer in that pity and fear are emotions Homer's works intend to arouse. But a rhapsode who has reflected on Homer's content, as Ion has not, will understand how those emotions may be aroused in ways which extol a virtue or inhibit a vice, which promote some view of justice and injustice, and which try to educate the emotions. Okay, such a rhapsode would not primarily be concerned with gaining money. Definitely not. The exposure of Ion's motives is an indirect argument for why art in general and a rhapsode's performance in particular cannot be justified simply as divinely inspired. Rather, art must be required to provide a rational explanation of itself. One can agree that art is emotional, as distinct from rational, and the experience of pity and fear is different from the experience of reflecting on pity and fear. But even though art is emotional, it should be evaluated according both to what emotions it evokes from audiences and to the goal of experiencing such an emotional response. The nature and purpose of the emotional response, as opposed to the motives of an artist or rhapsode selling emotions to get rich, is one way to distinguish between good and bad art, or between real art and propaganda or entertainment. If Homer's work evokes the emotions of pity and fear, then rhapsodes reciting Homer should be obliged to explain the goal of inducing these emotions. Since Socrates has also indicated that Homer's work treats questions of ethics and politics, any account of pity and fear in Homer must involve some view of how Homer intended to connect the experience of pity and fear to a view of human virtue and vice, or justice and injustice. Without having to give such an account, Ion has been able to exploit the Greek populace for money. There is no evidence that his audience is learning whatever Homer intended to teach through the use of pity and fear. There is evidence that his audiences are learning nothing at all. Since Homer's texts are used extensively to educate the Greeks in how to live well, Ion's abuse of those texts leaves the people without the moral guidance they need. Ion's goal is simply to gratify audiences by selling them a pleasurable emotional experience. He does not offer his audiences an artistic experience whose goal is to inspire the love of truth, virtue, or justice, and in particular the cultivation of practical wisdom for citizenship in their democratic society. Because Socrates understands the harm done by Ion's ignorance, he tries again to get Ion to admit what he does not know. He recites a second creative emotional speech which uses visual images, particularly the lodestone, and concludes, quote, "Not by art or science do you say of Homer what you say, but by dispensation from above." Okay, so Socrates gives these two very flowery, imaginative speeches. And so you can read the Ion if you want. But it's really, people have loved it. And they think, it's what Plato really thinks. It also comes in at 2/3 in the way through the dialogue. This is the peak of the dialogue. Again, Socrates is trying to humble Ion, to get Ion to admit that he thinks he knows more than he knows. Again, Ion will not admit his ignorance. Quote, "I should be very much surprised if by your argument you succeeded in convincing me that I am possessed or mad when I praise Homer." Unquote. Ion believes his ability to draw out audience emotion implies that he has some sort of art, techne, or knowledge, episteme. Okay, so the first flowery speech Socrates gave told Ion he was divinely inspired, and Ion was flattered, and that was great. Then Socrates layers it up again and gives this other one, and concludes that Ion must be mad or possessed, and that Ion doesn't like that. He's not so flattered by that. He wants to say he has a technique. Well, yeah, he has the same technique the sophists have. The sophists have the power of persuasion in the courts and in the assembly. Ion has the power of emotional manipulation and persuasion, persuading people to love him and give him money when reciting Homer. So he wants to think he's rather skilled. The final third of the dialogue focuses upon what sort of art or knowledge one could either display from reciting Homer or gain from listening to Homer, and whether Ion can identify it. Socrates' use of emotive, imaginative language in the analogy of the Rhapsode and the lodestone demonstrates another speech style and another way to distinguish between legitimate aesthetic experience and sophistry. In the first imaginative speech, Socrates uses emotive language to flatter Ion and inflate his ego. In the lodestone speech, Socrates uses visual images to humble Ion and get him to admit the limits of his knowledge. In both cases, Socrates fails as a physician of the soul to humble Ion and make him more reflective about what he does. Ion has not become psychologically healthier. The reader, however, can gain the insights Ion fails to grasp. First, that emotional experience needs to be accountable to rational explanation, and second, that emotional and aesthetic experience needs to be distinguished from art in the sense of techne and from knowledge in the sense of episteme. The third section shows why art must be distinguished from both techne and episteme. And this is clear. I mean, people with musicians, people say their technique is great, their knowledge of the instrument, blah, blah, but they're not inspired, right? They're not the very best musicians. It's a normal distinction people make. Socrates begins section 3 by showing indirectly that the subject matter of Homer is neither an art nor a kind of knowledge. He assumes audiences learn some sort of art or knowledge from reading Homer, but this claim terminates in an impasse. And so this would be the difference in the divided line between techne, which would be at the level of pistis, or knowledge would be at the level of dianoia, versus wisdom. Homer is trying to teach wisdom, which is it's intuitive, it's noetic. Okay. Ion refuses to admit he has no art or knowledge, and wants Socrates to explain what sort of techne, art, or knowledge he means. Thus far, however, it seems that Ion's real art or knowledge is his skill at making money and being popular. It's the art or knowledge of the sophist, the one who creates the appearance of a meaningful aesthetic experience and can fool the masses. In order to discover what exactly Ion's skill is, Socrates asks him, "On what point in Homer do you speak well? Not on all points, I take it," unquote. And Ion replies, "I assure you, Socrates, I do it on every point without exception," unquote. Socrates then interrogates Ion by quoting from Homer to see if Ion understands what Homer is saying. Socrates deliberately proposes a dubious way of reading Homer as a guidebook for gaining professional expertise. Quote, "Why, does not Homer in many passages speak of the arts and have much to say about them?" By which he means techne. About driving a chariot, for instance, unquote. Explicitly, Socrates acts as the Homeric Rhapsode. He takes over Ion's position by quoting directly from Homer. But instead of eliciting an emotional response, he quotes Homer in order to determine if Homer can teach his readers a professional skill, such as how to fish or drive a chariot. Socrates is deliberately misreading Homer to make his own argumentative points. This is where scholars get mad at Plato because that's totally wrong. He's totally misinterpreting Homer. But if you think of Socrates as the dialectician speaking to a certain kind of soul, trying to get him to be wiser, then it fits perfectly. Explicitly, Socrates is asking Ion if he considers these passages capable of improving the audience's or the rhapsode's skills at fishing or chariot driving. Socrates knows, of course, that Homer did not intend these passages to serve such a purpose. Rather, they must be understood within the poetic context in which Homer uses them. By discussing Homer as if his epics were technical manuals, Ion reveals he does not understand the meaning of what he gets paid so handsomely to recite. This quandary is the natural result of the problem which generated the dialogue. Ion makes a living reciting Homer and describes himself as a specialist. Sorry, the sun went under a cloud. And it was dark before and now it's okay. He refuses to admit that he should be more concerned about the content of Homer than about embellishing the words. He refuses to admit that he's only emotionally inspired and has no real knowledge at all. The only possibility left is that he has some skill. Ion's real skill is his ability to sell his wares to the public, which is the same as the sophists. Thus far, Ion has expressed his motives for reputation in wealth. In this section, his drive for power is gradually revealed. Ion's desire for power is first exposed when he claims what the rhapsode knows. Quote, "The kind of thing I judge, that a man would say and a woman would say, the suitable thing for each," unquote. This response is revealing and ironic in a number of ways. First, in the sense in which the statement is true, Ion has this kind of knowledge. Ion knows exactly the kind of thing a rhapsode should say, what speeches are socially acceptable and suitable for a rhapsode to gain a reputation. But to claim that this is what Homer is about, or all that Homer is about, leaves out the most important issues. If Homer is about the human condition, about virtue and vice and justice and injustice, and if Homer intends to draw out pity and fear, then the suitable thing to say is problematic. Could a man say the suitable thing and be wrong, hence being someone the audience should pity? Or could a man say the virtuous or just thing, but because it was not suitable or socially acceptable, be punished, and for this reason be the object of pity? Certainly in Homer, Agamemnon does not say the suitable thing all the time, nor does Achilles, and on and on. Certainly, if the suitable thing to say were not problematic, as Ion believes, then questions of virtue and vice, of justice and injustice, and their relations to emotions of pity and fear would not arise. The problematic, suitable thing to say is also ironic from Socrates' point of view. Socrates has a reputation for disputing with social and political leaders, and Plato's readers know the Athenians eventually deemed Socrates' speeches unsuitable, condemning Socrates to death for his unsuitable speech. Ion then has a reputation for saying the suitable thing, and yet it is clear he manipulates people for his own purposes. Socrates, on the other hand, is developing a reputation for saying what is unsuitable, and yet by this point in the dialogue, the reader understands why Socrates is right. Art should be joined with a rational account of its ultimate purpose. The final series of questions clarifies Ion's motives. Socrates questions Ion further about what speech is suitable. The speeches of a general exhorting his soldiers? Yes, that's the sort of thing the rhapsode will know. What, says Socrates? Is the rhapsode's art a general's? And Ion says, I cannot see a bit of difference. Ion thinks a good general is one who excites the troops emotionally, making them willing to go into battle and face danger. Ion claims that because he can manipulate people's emotions, he too would be a good general. Just as Ion does not read Homer with a desire to understand what Homer thinks about war, for example, about going into battle or not going into battle, about ethics and politics, Ion does not think a good general needs to know about virtue and vice, justice and injustice, and the relationships between men and between men and the gods. Further, Ion does not seem to think a good general must possess technical skills about how to position men in a battlefield or have knowledge of strategic planning. But the general's true art does require a study of human nature, of virtue and vice, of justice and injustice. It requires the study of war, and the Iliad is an entire book about a war. Only with such knowledge can a general decide which conflicts to settle peacefully and which must be resolved through armed conflict. Generalship also requires technical expertise so that battles can be won with the least possible loss of human life. The power of the rhapsode, divorced from such knowledge, will only encourage the bad general, one who's ignorant about whether a certain battle is worth fighting or how best to win it, to act from pride. Instead, a general will act from pride and seek glory by rousing soldiers into fighting dangerous and unnecessary battles. Although a rhapsode might make a useful instrument for a knowledgeable general, Ion clearly is ignorant of these insights in his performances of Homer, and is teaching that ignorance to his audiences. The art of the rhapsode is indeed analogous to generalship. A good rhapsode needs to study human nature, virtue and vice, justice and injustice, in order to recite from books about these subjects. A good rhapsode also needs the technical performance skill to lead an audience to a catharsis of pity and fear, purging irrational emotions from their souls. This in turn will lead the audience to understanding the mistaken judgment a character makes, who elicits pity and fear, and hence to a greater understanding of virtue and vice, justice and injustice. Greater insight reduces fear and instills courage to continue to live well in spite of the many ways humans make mistakes and are vulnerable. At the end of the dialogue, Socrates gives Ion these alternatives. Either he has knowledge and has refused to tell Socrates what it is, and hence is unjust, or his talent comes from divine inspiration, so he cannot explain what he knows, and hence is not unjust. Once again, Ion seeks flattery and chooses the second option. The dialogue has demonstrated, though, that the realm of the aesthetic is neither an art in the sense of a techne, nor a kind of knowledge in the sense of episteme. Socrates then has presented Ion with a false dilemma. Ion accepts the question and chooses the answer which flatters him. What feels good is what is true for Ion. Ion has not learned what Socrates implicitly is trying to teach. The purpose of the Ion dialogue is to point out three mistakes in judgment which Ion makes about the nature of art, and to indicate indirectly why these views are inadequate. First, art cannot focus primarily on style and embellishment. It must prioritize content. Style must follow from content. Second, art cannot be defined as mindless inspiration, which requires no rational account of itself. Although art is not rational discourse, it needs to be discussed. Otherwise, whatever audiences respond to emotionally can be considered art, leaving no distinction between emotional manipulation and true aesthetic experience. Third, art is not a professional skill like driving a chariot, fishing, or any other productive skill or knowledge which meets human physical needs and earns the worker's income. Rather, art is concerned with the needs of the human soul, the need to reflect on virtue and vice, justice and injustice. Art is concerned with culture and civilization, with living well, and hence cannot be motivated by the desire for reputation, wealth, or political power. In terms of the divided line, art should be the education of nous. It should be motivated by a noetic insight, wisdom, and an effort to educate people for wisdom, as opposed to dianoia, just knowledge, or techne, just a skill. The positions Ion takes on in the dialogue are not entirely wrong or idiosyncratic. Many people hold or have held these positions. The Ion shows why these positions cannot stand up in the face of rational examination. By the end of the dialogue, it's clear that Ion's mistaken views have led to mistaken actions. Just like Ion's view of the general as a man leading emotionally aroused soldiers into any sort of military conflict, Ion himself, as a rhapsode, creates emotional responses in his audiences which simply lead them into mindless emotional states. He's not passing on those insights about how to live which made Homer's work so highly valued among the Greeks. But given Ion's fame, the Greek soul evidently no longer knows or values those insights, and hence is unhealthy. But this is because the people are being misled. Even though Ion is exposed as either ignorant or corrupt, the dialogue is not pessimistic, for the dialogue itself presents a model of language which does not flatter or mislead people, and is committed to pursuing truth. Socrates uses discursive reasoning, imaginative speeches, and recitations from Homer, motivated by a pursuit of truth and leading to a greater understanding of art and aesthetic experience. Socrates has acted throughout the dialogue as the physician for Ion's unhealthy soul. He has tried to improve Ion's psychological health by purging him of false opinions. Most of all, Socrates wants to purge Ion of the falsehood that he, Ion, is the best rhapsode in Greece, and therefore must possess a kind of knowledge. Ion thinks he knows more than he really does. This is the worst kind of ignorance, the worst psychological obstacle, because, until that obstacle is removed, Ion is incapable of learning anything. The reader, however, does not have to react to Socrates' speeches the way Ion does. Readers can allow Socrates to ask them the questions, to be moved emotionally by Socrates' speeches, and to reflect more deeply than Ion on the difference between art and other kinds of knowledge or skill. Readers can pity Ion for his ignorance, and fear for their own ability to make the same mistakes in their understanding and experience of art. After all, anyone can be, and everyone has been, at least temporarily, mesmerized by a great performer. The question is whether the cause and effect of such an emotional experience needs to be articulated and a distinction made between emotional manipulation and aesthetic education. The ion is an indirect argument for positing some sort of unchanging intellectual notions of virtue and vice, justice and injustice, based on the human condition. Ion himself does not even consider whether Homer expresses such unchanging truths and tries to teach them. Ion simply assumes that his function as Rhapsode is to stimulate audience imagination and thereby audience emotions. Given such an assumption, Ion is indeed the most excellent of rhapsodes, because he is best at creating an imaginative scene and eliciting emotional reactions from audiences and judges. If vivid spectacle and intense emotion are both necessary and sufficient for great art and great recitations, Ion must be judged the best rhapsode of Homer at this time. Lacking a viewpoint outside of the cave from which to judge either Ion or Homer, no one has the authority to judge otherwise. Without unchanging truth, based on the human condition, whoever the majority agrees at a given moment is most pleasant and most moving will be voted the greatest artist or performer. Whoever is voted best is best. Plato, however, believed in a reality in addition to the world of appearances. Virtue and vice, justice and injustice, can be grasped by the human intellect, and the passion for greater insight about such powers can be nurtured in the human soul. It is the function of art to link human desire with the capacity to know, that is, to engender the love of wisdom. In fulfilling this aim, inspiration is distinguishable from rational discourse, but inspiration has to be accountable to rational explanation. Reason and inspiration should be different means to the same end. The emotions of pity and fear should be linked to the recognition of an error in judgment, hence the gaining of greater wisdom. On that definition, the Ion dialogue would qualify as philosophical art, or real art, because the dialogue itself exemplifies the union between emotion and reason. Readers should pity not only Ion, but also the Athenians for their mistake in judgment, leading them to conclude that Socrates, rather than Ion, corrupted them through his speech. On the contrary, Socrates exposed the Athenians' flaws and Ion's corruption, because he insisted, among other things, that aesthetic inspiration and emotional response and criticism to it be accountable to reason. Socrates united emotion and thought, both in his theoretical outlook and in his personal life, as the great lover of wisdom. It is clear, then, that literary texts can be used by those who recite or teach them to further personal, social, and political goals. No teacher is a detached observer. Teachers are only better or worse, according to the degree to which they're motivated by the desire for fame, money, or power on the one hand, or truth, virtue, and justice on the other. Not just Homer, but Plato's dialogues as well have been interpreted very differently based on the motives and cultural contexts of those who read and teach them. The interpretations and interpreters who are popular, who make the most money, and who use their reputations to gain political power, will reflect a great deal about the spirit of the times where they live. The health or illness of the souls of those who teach the great books in any society reflects the health or illness of the society as a whole. When those teaching the great books no longer believe in or cannot distinguish between good and evil, justice and injustice, truth and falsity, the society is in a state of decline. Okay. Wow.